Y'all, it is too hot to camp, but it is perfect weather for thinking about camping. So you may have seen those get ready with me videos. It's like a trend where people are like getting gussied up and ready to go out and spilling the tea. Well, this is sort of like that, except the only thing I am getting ready for is camping, and the only tea I'm spilling is how I plan for it. I hope you have some time to hang out with me in these beautiful virtual royalty-free woods, because it takes me about 2 or 3 months to plan for a camping trip. To start, I have some general guidelines, and starting with the where. So the first thing I think about is, how's the weather? So if it's hot down here, I will head to the high elevations to cool off. If it's chilly, I will stick around here to the low desert. The second thing is how far. So 1 or 2 hours is kind of my ideal distance in a day. I really don't like driving, and the time, it just like eats up my fun time. So 1 or 2 hours, that's enough time to change the scenery without being exhausting. But I will go up to 3 or 4 hours for something really special. But I'll usually make that a 2-nighter, just to kind of make it worth it, And finally, I like to mix it up. I like to change directions where I'm going. I like to change the landscape. I like to change the type of camping I'm doing, whether it's boondocking or at a campground, just to keep things interesting. Now, with those guidelines in mind, it's time to sort of zoom in on a specific destination. And for that, I keep a running list of ideas. And like most of my life, I keep that list in Notion. I use Notion for everything. It's free, it's really easy to use, you kind of want to get the hang of it, and works great on desktop and mobile. I regularly come across ideas and I'll put it on my sort of idea list. And I get those ideas from a pretty wide selection of sources. Of course, social media is a big resource. I have friends who camp and post where they're going and that sort of thing. I belong to several groups on Facebook where people share their adventures and talk about where they've gone. And I also follow pages that promote tourism. They share a lot of places too. One thing I do is, once I've settled on a region, is just sort of zoom in on Google Maps and just scroll around and just see what's around. And I'll just click on different points and save them to a list in Google Maps, which is another resource I use a lot. Sometimes I'll just browse through Hipcamp or similar and just see if there's a cool place, and oh, that looks neat, I'm gonna check that out. So I have lists there too, little wish lists that I revisit if I'm looking for something unique. And sometimes it's just a matter of paying attention when you're out in the field. So if I'm driving around, if I'm headed to a site or a camping area, I just keep my eyes peeled, especially when it comes to boondocking sites. Future reference, looks like you can camp out here. I mean, it's not the most beautiful spot, but seems pretty remote. Now, once I have the where figured out, it's time to focus on the when. I typically travel every 4 to 6 weeks, and I prefer overnighters. But as I mentioned, sometimes I'll make it 2 nights. That's about the max for me. After that, I'm ready to get home. I also avoid holidays, and if I can, weekends. There are just too many people out on the roads and in the wild, and it just wrecks my solitude. I am grateful that I have enough flexibility in my job that I can travel this way. And then there's usually a why too, what am I looking for on this trip? And sometimes it's around a very specific event, and that will also dictate the dates on that. So it might be an event or a festival, something like that I want to plan around. But most of the time it's just sort of a vague desire, what do I want to see and do? And sometimes it's just I want to be on the water, or I want to be in a really piney forest, or I want epic views, So that's a guiding principle too. Other times it's just more of a vague desire, I just want to get out of the heat, or I just want to go stick my toes in the creek. Or sometimes it's an activity, I want to go mountain biking, or I want to go fishing, or looking for mushrooms. So that can guide where I'm going to and when. Once I've got my date and destination all sorted out, start zooming in on that specific place to camp. What campground or dispersed area do I want to go to? And the first thing I have to decide when I'm looking for exactly where to camp is, do you want to go dispersed or do you want to go campground? It's a matter of I'm looking for like convenience or peace and quiet. Book a campsite, I know exactly where I'm going, my spot is saved, I don't have to stress about it. I have amenities nearby, I might have a bathroom, showers, running water, table, fire ring, stuff like that. It just ease some of the burden off of me. However, I will have neighbors. And how many, how close they are, and what they're like is always a wild card. And like regular campgrounds, Hipcamps are like private campgrounds, and there are other private campgrounds too, other than Hipcamp. So it's like a campground, but kind of not. So it's like a campground, you get a reserved spot, it costs you some money, you'll get some amenities which vary from place to place, and I may or may not have a neighbor, but it's usually just like maybe one or two and kind of far away. Now, if I decide that I'm willing to give up some of the convenience of a campground and I really just want some peace and quiet, I'll go boondocking or dispersed camping, whatever you want to call it. Off-grid camping is just like a place in the woods where you park and you got to bring everything with you. The likeliness of peace and quiet, usually much higher. You can still get rude neighbors, close neighbors, loud neighbors, but it's less likely, at least out here. But there are no reserved spots, so you just gotta go on luck and hope that something's available. I have never run into not finding a spot, but it is a possibility. And then, of course, you have to bring all your own amenities. I have to bring like my table, my bathroom situation, everything down to the kitchen table. But it is free, so that's another thing to think about. And then there's stealth camping, which is not really my thing. I did it one time just to try it out, but it's kind of more like boondocking in that you do have to bring all your stuff, and it's free. You may or may not have neighbors. You probably will. And the difference is that then you don't have any outdoor space or anything. You're pretty much confined to your vehicle. So just for an example of a boondocking trip, like how I got there and how I planned it. Let's just say Gunther's birthday that we went to in July. His birthday is July 3rd, but that is awful close to the 4th of July, so we did it early because holidays. Yeah, I chose boondocking because we had just gotten back from our road trip. I've been around a ton of people all the time and just wanted a little solitude. And the weather's hot, so we went to higher elevation. Also, since we had just done our road trip, I had done hours and hours and hours of driving, and I just did not feel up to driving far. So if I wanted to go high up and not go more than a couple hours, that meant the Flagstaff area. Now, the greater metro area of Flagstaff forbids camping, so I had to look a little farther out. And for that, I used the Coconino National Forest's motor vehicle use map. It's not the most user-friendly thing, but it is very specific and very helpful. And I covered exactly how I used that to find this spot in Gunther's birthday video. And the U.S. Forest Service offers these maps for, I think, just about every national forest. So if you just look for whatever national forest and motor vehicle use map, it'll come up. Some other resources I use to find my dispersed camping sites are just Google Maps. That I will just scroll around. Sometimes people have marked them, and I will check them out, and then there's usually reviews and photos and all that sort of thing to give you some more information. I also use iOverlander sometimes. It's not the most visually appealing. You know, the descriptions are text and you might get a couple photos. So I usually follow it up with some Googling once I find a place that I like. There's also freecampsites.net, the Dyrt, Campendium. I like using those later ones because there's often RVers who write reviews on there. So that'll give you a little bit insight on what the road conditions are like. If they complain that they're impassable, you know, 4Runner probably still could make it. But if you're driving a car, then you might want to pay attention to what they say. I also use the Bureau of Land Management's website. Again, not the most user-friendly. You have to really dig and look around on the maps to try and find, areas that are allowed. And also, one lesser-known one is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website, because some national wildlife refuges allow you to camp. So now let's just say I'm feeling lazy, I've got money to burn, let's find a campground. And I remembered the last time I was down in Tucson, I went to Mount Lemmon just for a hike. And when I was there, I was like, this might be a nice place to camp. I should spend some more time here. So that's the whole sort of keeping your eyes peeled thing, and just like for future reference. So I think that is where I'm gonna head because the elevation is very high It's less than 2-hour drive down there to the Catalina Mountains, and so that's going to be beautiful weather, but not a whole lot of dispersed camping. So I'm pretty much stuck with going to a campground. So I poked around on Recreation.gov and I found a federal campground on the mountain. It even has a little lake. So I booked the site online, which cost me about $34 plus fees and taxes, and it's only $24 if you show up in person, but I am not a risk taker, so I would much rather pay the extra money and have a definite site. And as you'll see in a little bit, I am very finicky about my specific campsite, so I like to pick my campsite before I show up. Other websites I use when it comes to campground camping here, again, I stick to Arizona, so Arizona State Parks, and the sites for specific county and regional parks. So Maricopa County Parks is one that I use. They have a couple campgrounds nearby. And then for private run campgrounds, I typically use Hipcamp, though there are others. I know there's like Harvest Hosts and some others, but I think they seem more geared to RVs. So I noticed on Hipcamp there is a specific category for SUVs and cars and vans. Not all the hosts flag them as such, but they do exist, which is nice. So once I found my campground, it's time for the very serious business of finding my ideal campsite. As far as location goes, I want to be away from the entrance, off the main road, with a good amount of space between me and my neighbors. I usually pick the last site on a loop. You can see on the campground maps usually exactly how far apart everything is, and I also tend to stay away from restrooms, dumpsters, trailheads, anything that might attract humans and animals. I also like to look for a site with some natural tree cover and some shrubs around, and if possible, a really nice view. The maps that are provided both online, and you can usually find the print one online too, are usually pretty vague and not exact. I like to get my eyes on the campsites, and there are some tools I use for that. Campsitephotos.com. Most of the campgrounds I look for are on there, but not all of them, and it's literally just a person in a car driving around and snapping a photo every single site. And sometimes the photos are good and informative, and sometimes they're not. So that's one place to look. Another place to look is Google, both the satellite view. Sometimes that's a little limited because there's tree cover, so you can't really get a good look at the campsites, but it's somewhat helpful. And also the Google, when you go to Google Maps and you go to a campground and look at the reviews, you can see everybody's photos, and sometimes you will see specific campsites in there. If you're lucky enough, they've taken a picture of the number too, and so that'll give you really good firsthand knowledge of a site. And one I discovered recently is Campgroundviews.com. They're virtual tours of campgrounds, and they're free in Arizona thanks to the Arizona Department of Tourism. But it is like a camera mounted to a golf cart that goes around the campground with the camera, and you can swivel it, and you can zoom in, you can pause, and there's a little flag on each campsite that you can click on, and you can get the campsite number, whether it's reservable or not reservable. So that has been a really great tool. It was very handy for my next trip to Tucson because my other resources were just not panning out, and it's also a very difficult campground to choose the right site for an SUV. The reason I say that is because federal and many state campgrounds, you have to choose tent or RV site. And if you are car camping or sleeping in your SUV, you're kind of neither. So what do you choose, tent or RV site? Ideally, some of them have ones that are either tent or RV, and that's my ideal choice, but sometimes it's specific. So there are pros and cons to each one. So tent sites are typically fine for me in an SUV because I can fit just fine. Sometimes they're even cheaper. There are a couple of caveats that you have to look for. One, big one, where is the parking for your site? Because sometimes they're detached. Sometimes they're even shared. Your tent pad will be over here and your parking spot's over here and you're next to like 3 other vehicles. And if you're sleeping in your vehicle, that is not an ideal situation. Secondly, a lot of times you'll see on the website equipment required. And if you're on a tent site, they mean a tent. So if you're not setting up a tent, then you might get harassed. And I have heard of people who carry a decoy tent. And so it's just the cheapest tent you could find, and you just set it up in your spot, and if anybody gives you trouble, like, well, here's my tent. I usually bring the Sports Cove or some other like enclosable awning, whether or not I plan on using it, just in case the host comes by and asks me where my tent is, because typically the Sports Cove will qualify as a tent because it's an SUV tent. I have not been challenged yet to produce a tent, but I carry it just in case. Now, RV sites always have the parking spot right there because you're camping in an RV. But if you're in an SUV or a car, you're not an RV. Sometimes you'll see that equipment required warning attached to an RV site, because I guess some campgrounds don't want passenger vehicles using up those precious RV spots, you know, if they're limited number of those. I haven't yet stayed in an RV specific campsite yet, so I am not sure what the workaround is for that. But I do have one booked, so wish me luck. So I've got my campsite booked, or I know exactly where I'm going, everything's all set. Now it's time for the real planning, the detail planning, I should say. And that's when I sort of move the destination from the ideas list over to its own file. And then over the next month or so, I'll start building a loose agenda. I don't attach times to things that I want to do other than check in and check out, so it's not like a schedule, but things I want to see and do each day. And then also a menu and a to-do list and a packing list. It's actually several packing lists. I have a general packing list, the camping packing list that I just copy over to every file, and then I edit it according to where I'm going and what I need. And then I also have lists for containers. So I have a little list for the kitchen and one for the cooler and one for the gearbox and everything. So I know exactly what needs to go in each thing. The other cool thing about Notion is I can also embed bookmarks, like website bookmarks and maps and stuff, all the information I need for my trip. When it gets to be about a week out, that's when I start dragging out all my gear. So I'll pull the kitchen out of the shed, I keep my little gearbox in the guest room, and I'll just pull everything out. I had some questions about how I save space and make sure not to bring too much. One thing I do is edit the contents of everything. So for instance, if it's the warm weather, I'm not bringing the heater, so I don't need the carbon monoxide detector, you know? If it's cold, I probably don't need the fan. And then also, I prefer things that do many jobs. I don't like unitaskers. If I have something, I better do two things at least. If it does three or four, then I'm in love. The other thing is I like things that can collapse, you know, or squish down or nest. If you can nest multiple things together, great space saver. I also edit my cookware, so I look at my menu and that will determine what cookware I need to bring. And also when I'm menu planning, I try to stick to just a couple cooking methods so that I can reuse the same cookware. And maybe a couple days beforehand, I'll get my electronic media together, so that usually means downloading a movie from Apple TV. I'll download podcasts and playlists from Spotify onto my phone. Offline maps if I need them, if I'm going where there's not signal. Sometimes I will screenshot directions from Google Maps or for a Hipcamp, and I just save in my photos. So just getting all that stuff offline and ready. Also during this time, I use the menu to create a shopping list of the ingredients I need, and I'll put them in my grocery order. And then when they arrive, I'll usually repackage things into smaller packages. I don't need to bring a whole container of whatever, so that's a space saver too. We're down to the day before, and that is when I try and load up as much as I can. Anything that I feel is safe in the 4Runner overnight, I will put it in there, which is just about everything. And then I also pack my clothes, and I usually keep the selection pretty limited. Everything is like mix and match. I don't bring PJs, I just bring like cozy clothes that I could sleep in and also wear the next morning around the campsite. So I keep it pretty minimal, and then I layer up. That saves a lot of space. And then some safety measures. The night before, I will usually text Ames my plans, when I'm rolling out, when I'm coming home, where I'm headed. If I'm going to a Hipcamp, I will also give her the host's phone number, just in case. And finally, we're down to the big day, departure. That is when I will fill the water jug, I'll pack the cooler and load it up, and I'll also put in any sort of valuable items that I didn't want to leave in the 4Runner overnight. So that's usually like power bank, laptop, camera, equipment. Then we're about ready to roll. Except for one more safety thing, and I'll share my location with Ames, and I usually use Google for that. And that is the whole journey before the journey. So I hope you get some good tips out of that when you're planning your next trip.